It's the International Soccer Preview, and we are Soccerphiles Canada. Welcome to Series 28, looking at the groups and teams of the 2024 Copa America. This episode is looking at the players of Peru. Here we go! Hello and welcome again to the International Soccer Preview by Soccerphiles Canada. I'm Kevin, and we continue Series 28 on the groups and players of the 2024 Copa America. This episode covers Peru's players, and in fact it's part 2 of the Players Media Cast, and here we look at the selections. In part 1 we made a list of the candidates and introduced them and their likelihood of making the squad. And there is a link to that, part 1, in the show notes. This episode, part 2, will be divided into 3 sections. In section 1, we'll take a quick look at their preliminary squad and their warm-up games. Section 2 is the main part of the media cast. We look over the list that we compiled in part 1 to see who made it and who didn't. And in section 3, we summarize surprises in the selections and review injuries. Let's begin then with section 1, a quick look at their preliminary squad and warm-up games. So Peru put out a 44-player preliminary squad there. That was on May 18th. No, they put out a partial preliminary roster on May 18th. They put out the 44-man roster on May 30th and reduced that to 26 players. 26 players, the final roster there on June 15th. So 44 players means that 18 of them have to be cut. And June 15th was actually after their warm-up games there. And I'm not actually sure if this one replacement they made was before the final squad or before. I suspect it, or after I should say, I suspect it was before because there wasn't a replacement player. So I think this player basically is counted as one of the 18 players cut from the preliminary squad. Anyway, we will get to that, and let's take a look at their warm-up games. So they had 2 of them. The first was against Paraguay, and the second was against El Salvador. Both of those games taking place in the United States. Yes, played in the United States. We don't really care about the scores. We just care about the lineups in those games. So I'll just say at the outset that, I can't really determine if one or the other is a starting lineup. Some players play both games. It seems like the players selected are all kind of potential starters because we saw in part 1 that a lot of positions were undecided. So we can't say for sure which ones are going to be started. It seems to be kind of under consideration during these 2 warm-up games. Okay, let's go to section 2, the candidate selections. And we begin with the manager and say that, the manager wasn't fired before the Cup. So Jorge Fossati will say he was selected and he will lead them through the Cup. Next, we move on to goalkeepers, and we had a definite candidate in Pedro Galici, and he was selected. We had a likely candidate in Carlos Cacheda. He too was selected. And then we had 2 possible candidates, Renato Solis and Diego Romero. Both of those possible, but Diego Romero got the nod and was selected. We had a possible but unlikely candidate, Alejandro Duarte, and he was not selected for the squad. Looking at the warm-up games, it is Pedro Galici who started both of them, so that gives us further confidence that he was the starter. We did feel confident in part 1 that he would be. Okay, to defenders, and looking at central defenders, we had no definite candidates. That's kind of indicative of the of the kind of uncertainty over players. So we had no definite, but three likely candidates. The first one was Louis Abram. He was selected. Also, Alexandra Callens was selected, and Miguel Araujo, the third likely candidate. All three of them selected. Make that four possible candidates there. The first two of whom were selected. That's Anderson Santamaria, and the second, Carlos Zambrano, also selected for the final squad. However, the other two, Carlos Asquez and Eric Noriega, neither of those selected. We go down the list actually to retired candidates, and we see Renzo Garces, and he was selected for the preliminary squad. He didn't make the final cut, so a bit unusual to see the two possible candidates not selected even for the preliminary squad. But this player, who hadn't played for the national team since January 2022, called back into the squad, but not making it ultimately. In terms of the warm-up games there, we have a three-man backline in both games. We saw in part one that the manager favored a 3-5-2 formation. These ones are similar. The first game was a 3-4-1-2, and the second one 3-4-2-1. So not that different from the 3-5-2. And in the first game, it was Zambrano in the middle. I'm sorry, I made a mistake. The second game was a 3-5-2, just like the manager usually goes with. Anyways, Zambrano in the middle for both of them. On the left, it was Callens in the first game and Abram in the second game. Both of those were definite candidates for us. And on the right side of that three-man defense, Araujo starting both games. So Zambrano and Araujo starting both games. Whereas Callens and Abram are two definite candidates, just starting one each. And we hadn't been able to make a prediction in part one as to who would be the starters there. So those warm-up games give some indication of what the manager is thinking. Okay, let's go to left backs. Here too, we had no definite candidate, but we did have two likely candidates. The first, Marcos Lopez, was selected for the squad, but the second one, in a bit of a surprise, was Miguel Trauco. We saw in part one that he was always called up to the squad, even if he only started half of the matches, but not called up here, and nor was possible but unlikely candidate Nilson Loyola. And you should keep in mind that this also means they weren't called up to the large 44-man preliminary squad. So I was looking for signs of an injury there for Trauco, but didn't find any reason. Okay, so for the warm-up games, we have again it could be a left back and a right back pushing up to play the left wing and right wing roles in the 3-5-2 or in any three-man defense. And in this case, that is not the case. It was our likely candidate, Marcos Lopez, the only candidate here as a left back, playing both games. But since he is the only candidate, we're wondering what will happen if he gets injured. We guess that someone from the left or perhaps a central defender would come into the role. Okay, moving over to right backs. Again, no definite candidates. But two likely candidates in Luis Advincula and Aldo Corzo. Both of them were selected. Luis Advincula, Aldo Corzo. We had a possible candidate in Olivier Son, and he too was selected for the final squad. And that's all we have on this side. Let's see who started the games. Actually, it was a more attacking player, and Andy Polo in the first game, and in the second game it was Advincula pushing up into that right midfielder role, right winger role. Okay, on we go to defensive midfielders, and here we have a definite candidate in Yoshima Yotun. But he had an injury tag on him even when we talked about that in part one, and he was not selected for the squad, even for the preliminary squad. So we'll talk about the nature of his injury in the next section. Meanwhile, the other definite candidate here, Wilder Cartagena, was selected for the squad. Here we have two possible candidates, Renato Tapia. This is the player I talked about in section one, where we're not sure when he withdrew, but he did withdraw from the squad. We think it was from the preliminary squad, but he had been a possible candidate and withdrew. We'll presume it's from the preliminary squad because no one was called up to replace him, and they have 26 players. The other possible candidate is Pedro Aquino, and he was not selected for the squad. You may be wondering where all of the preliminary squad players that were cut are, and we will get to that, but we haven't met many so far. Okay, in terms of oh, no, we won't talk about the position until we look at the central midfielders here. So in central midfielders, no definite or likely candidates, but we had Castillo, Jesus Castillo as a possible candidate, and he was selected. We also had Martin Tavera as a possible candidate. He was selected only for the preliminary squad. So fairly thin in the midfield here, especially with Yoshimar Yotun missing. Let's see how they managed in the warm-up game. So we see two central midfielders in the first game, the 3-4-1-2, and it is Tapia and Cartagena. So Tapia, the one who withdrew from the squad. And in the second game, it was a three-man midfield, Cartagena once again, and it was Pena and Quispe. Those are attacking midfielders who we will meet soon. So again, yes, with the 3-5-2, it could be defensive and central midfielders, or it could be attacking midfielders in that three-man central midfield. Anyway, it looks like Cartagena will be a starter. We hadn't been sure enough in part one to take a guess, but now it looks clearly like it will be him. I didn't say what our prediction was in for the left back and right back, so I'll just go back and do it. For the left back position, we had predicted a rotation between Lopez and Trauco based on participation over the last year and a half. But of course, Trauco not selected, so now we would throw our weight behind Marcos Lopez as the left back starter. On the right side, we thought Aldo Corzo would be the starter. If you want the reasons, you could go back to part one and listen. But he didn't appear in either of the warm-up games there. So we'd have to say perhaps Luis Advincula, or perhaps someone further upfield like Andy Polo, an actual attacking player. Okay. On we go to the attacking part of the field ourselves. So we'll meet Andy Polo up here. But we begin with left attackers, and once again, no definite candidates here, speaking to the uncertainty of team selection over the last half of the period where the new manager came in. But for left attackers, we have a likely candidate in Brian Reina. Excuse me, hang on a sec. And another likely candidate in Franco Zaniolato. Both of those were selected for the final squad. We had one player who seemed to be off the squad. That was Luis Ibaquero. Luis Iberico, and he was selected for the preliminary squad, but didn't make the final cut there. So we have Reina and Zanolato, and we have an injury concern for Reina. That's brand new. It wasn't a part of our part one media cast, but it has come up since, and we'll talk about that in the next section. Okay, right attacking midfielders. We have a likely candidate in João Grimaldo. He was selected for the squad, and a possible candidate in Andy Polo, who we saw starting as a winger in the first game. Okay, so let's look at the warm-up squad. I'll have to go back and kind of retrofit the left side because I forgot to talk about it. But in the first game, there was no left attacking midfielder in the 3-4-1-2. But in the second one, it was, Lopez, the defender, pushing up to the winger role in the 3-5-2. So in both games, we do have a left forward. But we consider it a forward rather than an attacking midfielder. On the right side, we saw Andy Polo as a winger, but no right attacking midfielder there. And it was Advincula pushing up in the second game. So we don't see either of these we don't see Grimaldo, and we see Andy Polo as a winger rather than more of an attacking midfielder. That's because of the formation they used. Let's move on to central attacking midfielders, and we have a long list here. Two likely candidates in Piero Quispe and Sergio Pena, both of those selected for the squad, and we already saw them as central midfielders in that 3-5-2 formation of the second game. We had two possible candidates. The first was Andre Carrillo. He was selected, but there is an injury tag on him that we'll have to talk about later. Christopher Gonzalez, our second possible candidate, however, was not selected even for the preliminary squad. But we do have one player who's seemingly off the squad, and I'm quite happy about it because I like watching Christian Cueva. So he was selected not only for the preliminary squad, but for the final squad. Even though there is an injury tag on him, we had him as seemingly off the squad because he hadn't been selected for the last 10 matches. And I won't go into the full bio on him, because we have a lot to talk about here. But he's been part of every tournament for Peru since the 2015 Copa America. So I was sad to see him as seemingly off the squad. But alas, he's not. He is here. Next, we have Jairo Concha. Jairo Concha seemingly off the squad, but made it to the preliminary squad. But not the final cut. And actually, we're generally not talking about players who seem to be off the squad or who are retired unless they actually come back into the picture. So we have two more other candidates there, but they weren't selected, so we'll leave that alone. And then we'll talk about the warm-up game. So in the first game, it was our likely candidate, Piero Quispe, playing as the attacking midfielder in the 3-4-1-2. And then we saw in the second game that in the 3-5-2, Pena and Quispe both starting in the central midfield along with Cartagena. So Quispe starting both games there, perhaps suggesting that the manager has him in mind as a starter for all position in the midfield, left attackers, right attacker, and central attackers. We couldn't nominate anyone that we thought would be a starter. In fact, there were no definite candidates in any of those three categories. So we do get a bit of a hint in the warm-up games here, especially about Quispe starting both games. On we go to the forward line. And we have a definite candidate in Paulo Guerrera. He was an injury doubt when we did part one, but he was selected. But I'll say here, he didn't start either of the games. He subbed into each one in about the 60-minute mark. So we're wondering if he's still carrying a bit of an injury, but great to have him at the Cup. He is he is 40 years old now, a real veteran, but still going. He was a definite anyway. Gianluca Lapadula was a likely candidate, and he was selected. And then we had two possible candidates. The first one, Alex Valera, only made it to the preliminary squad, but didn't make the final cut there. But the second one did, Jose Rivera, selected for the final squad. Then we had two possible but unlikely candidates, Santiago Ormeño and Matthias Sukar. Neither of those selected even for the preliminary squad. However, we had a player seemingly off the squad, a kind of a veteran, Raul Rio Diaz, who was selected for the preliminary squad, but didn't make the final squad. He hadn't started any of their last 6 matches, so we thought he was off the squad, and it turns out ultimately he is. Okay, other players there we won't talk about because they were not really candidates. So where are all our preliminary squad players? Well, we have a whole bunch of them that we'll talk about in part 2, but we didn't add them to the list because they only made it to the preliminary squad and not the final squad. Most of them have no caps to the national team, and I don't think I'll even name most of them, but we'll get there. Well, we'll get there right away here because we're moving on to section 3, where we look at, or we begin with a review of the surprises, and then we'll talk about injuries. So notable non-selections there. We have Miguel Trauco, the left defender, who we considered a likely candidate, but he was not selected. And now I'll get to the story of Renato Tapia, who withdrew, we'll say, from the preliminary squad. He withdrew himself because the Peruvian Football Association refused to insure him. So normally players are insured by their clubs. That means if they get injured, seriously injured, they'll be paid while they're under injury. Tapia's contract with Celta de Vigo ended. I think it ended June 30th, but anyway, it won't cover him for the whole tournament. And he asked the national team if he would be covered by them, and he didn't get a clear answer that they would insure him. So he felt he had no choice but to withdraw from the squad. Kind of understandable, but they missed the services of Renato Tapia. We had him as just a possible candidate anyway, but we did see he started the first warm-up game. So perhaps it was a bit more possible than we thought. We'll look at a couple of veterans who are off the team. Jefferson Farfan is a notable, a notable absence rather than a notable non-selection. He retired in December 2022, so they're without him. Christian Ramos, also a veteran, who was a starter in the Copa America, and manager Ricardo Gareca, who led them through 5 tournaments from 2015 onwards, including the 2018 World Cup. So a notable absence there. Surprise inclusions include Christian Cueva. We had him as seemingly off the squad, but he is back. We have more to say about him in the injury section. We won't talk about many surprises for the we won't spend a lot of time on the surprises for the preliminary squad, but we do have a couple we want to mention. Raul Rui Diaz. All of these players were seemingly off the squad, or even perhaps on the retired list, not that they had officially retired, but have been off not long enough that we considered them retired from the national squad. Anyway, Raul Rui Diaz brought back for the preliminary squad. Renzo Garces, the central midfielder. Left winger Luis Iberico, and attacking midfielder Jairo Concha. All of them were very much unexpected. We look at new players, and we have, let me see, 3, 6, 9, 10. So 10 of the 18 players cut were new players who were brought in. No caps for the national team. Most of them had never even been called up to the bench. And I'll just mention the first one because he's kind of an interesting case. It's Kevin Quevedo. He will represent the lot, I suppose. He is 27 years old, so quite a bit older than most of them. Most of them are in their early 20s. In his case, though, he was called up for the preliminary squad for the 2019 Copa America, and had played for the team ahead of the 2021 Copa America, and also named to this preliminary squad. So poor Kevin Quevedo kind of coming close several times, but not actually making the team. The 9 other players may come into the picture in the future. They're all quite young for the most part. Jorge Muragara actually had been nominated to the preliminary squad for the 2020 Copa America, so I'll mention him too. Anyway, the others we may see in the future. But I will write here 10 players on the graphic. And move on to the injury section. So we first of all have players who seem to have recovered from injury. Paulo Guerrero at least recovered enough to be named to the final squad, but apparently not recovered enough to start either of the warm-up games. So he had been out with a torn muscle bundle since early May, and in part 1 he was an unknown return date. But he has returned and is named to the squad. We'll have to see if he's fit enough to start game 1. Next, right back, Luis Advincula. Ooh, can you imagine if they were missing these players? Luis Advincula was out with an unknown, no, he was out with an abductor tear and an unknown return date. And we had thought that was a fairly recent injury happening after the end of the season. Because he had played on May 20th, or we thought he was probably injured in that game because he subbed out of the game 36 minutes in. Anyway, because that was such a late injury, we didn't think he'd make it to the squad, but here he is. And he did start one of the games, so he seems to have recovered. Andre Carrillo, an attacking midfielder, again would have been a huge loss. He had been out with an unknown injury from May 13th with an unknown return date in part 1, but now he is selected for the squad. He did not start either of the warm-up games, so is possibly still recovering and a bit of an injury doubt, but he was selected for the squad. Next, we have players who are injury doubts, but they're still on the roster. So basically, these are recent injuries. Christian Cueva on the injury list with what's called a contracture. So he's still on the injury list. A contracture is a tightening of the muscles, but he was selected. He was listed as injured for the first game. No, he was listed as injured for both games, Christian Cueva. So maybe we'll hear about him as recovering still from injury in the Cup. The other one is very much the same situation. Brian Reina, he's on the injury list with a contracture also, and that prevented his participation in the first of the 2 warm-up games. However, he was on the bench for the others, suggesting that he was recovered enough to be on the bench. Okay, so we'll have to see in the Cup if anything comes of that. We have 1 player dropped due to injury. That is Yoshimar Yutun. A bit of a loss there. He was a definite candidate. He was out with an inner ligament injury I also saw that described as a partial muscle tear. The injury was from early May and had an unknown return date. So apparently, the veteran with 128 caps uh, uh, was prevented from joining the squad due to that injury. All right, phew, that was a lot to talk about, and we're done. I just have a closing thought. On our YouTube page, we got a comment from Pepe, who writes, "It's not the best team, but we're going to give them our support." And well, Pepe, I think Peru is a pretty good team. We think they have a decent chance of getting out of this group, and we like that Peru has sometimes done surprisingly well in cups. So we're cheering for Peru here, and yeah, we'll give them our support too. Okay, that brings us to the end of the mediacast. So we hope our look at the players helps you to enjoy the cup that much more. We would like to thank Paul Udin and Pixabay for the wonderful background music accompanying this mediacast. The piece is called Victory Epic Music.